Hello, my name is Benson, and I'm the Director of the Center for Teaching Excellence at the University of Maryland, and I'm a member of the ASM International Education Committee. We are excited about being able to do this joint workshop between the Philippine Society for Microbiology and the American Society for Microbiology. I want to thank my Philippine colleagues for their part in this workshop. This workshop will have the following parts. We'll do some introductions, and then we will look at what is backwards design. In backwards design, we look at learning outcomes, assessments, and learning activities, and their relationship to each other in developing a procedure or a mechanism or a way of thinking about how to teach. Let us begin with a short question. The question is, what's the primary goal in my course? Is it to cover basic material, impart new discipline knowledge, facilitate student learning, ensure student success, or perhaps you have some other goal? What I'd like you to do is introduce yourself to the person beside you or the people around you and tell them which of the above is the primary goal in your teaching. We're going to pause the video here for a short piece to allow you to do this. Welcome back. Backwards design is a process whereby we can think about the development of a curriculum, a course, or a learning activity such as a project. It contains three parts. The first part is determining the learning outcomes or learning objectives on this. And so what do we desire the students to have learned as a result of their activities? The second question is, how will we know if they learned that? What will be the evidence that they've accomplished the learning outcomes that we have described? This evidence can be both formal and informal assessments. The third part is what pedagogies, what learning activities will we use to accomplish the first two? Now, the process is reiterative because often we find that in deciding on the learning outcomes, we need to change the assessments or vice versa, and the pedagogies are often adapted after we begin the process. So the process is reiterative but contains three components: determining learning outcomes, identifying what acceptable evidence is, and then developing appropriate learning activities or pedagogy. Let's begin by thinking about priorities. When we teach, there are many different levels of learning that will occur in our class. And so it is worthwhile to begin by thinking about what is the learning that is worth being familiar with. This might be knowledge that allows one to find or retrieve information. This might be a tool set. The second level in the circle is what knowledge and skills are important to know and be able to do. An example is that we expect our students to be able to effectively write and communicate orally. Also, it could be knowing which test in microbiology to use, where to find certain organisms. So these are important things. But most critical is deciding what will be the enduring understandings that the students will know for the test, for the next course, and as they go out into their professional lives. So, three things: worth being familiar with, important to know and do, and enduring understandings. Let's turn to worksheet activity 1. I want you to think about one of your courses and write down one or two items for each level. Something that's worth being familiar with. Something that's important to know and do. And finally, and most importantly, what are the enduring understandings that your students will take away from this course or this learning activity, such as a project? This is work time now, and we're going to pause the video here and allow my Philippine colleagues to work with you on that. After you have come up with a list of these items, we're going to take some time to share them, and you will report them out to the people beside you. Welcome back. Let's talk about learning outcomes. Learning outcomes answer the following guiding questions. What will my students know? What will my students be able to do? What will my students be able to appreciate? Learning outcomes are determined by you, the instructor. And they describe measurable objectives or outcomes. Often we see different terminologies here. Sometimes they're referred to as objectives, sometimes as outcomes. I will use the term outcome on that. They start with the following phrase: students will be able to. This means that after completing the activity or the course or the curriculum, these are the things that students will be able to know, do, or appreciate. We're going to write some learning outcome. When people first start writing learning outcomes, they often start by writing course goals. Course goals and outcomes are not the same thing, although they are related. Goals are the overarching guide and envisioned endpoint, and often they are not readily measurable. An example of a goal for the University of Maryland is that students will become lifelong learners. A goal will be for microbiology is that students will appreciate the use and the impact of microbiology in their life beyond the university. Remember, outcomes are things that we can readily measure directly. And so we use the phrase, students will be able to do, and you fill in the blank here. Some goals and outcomes overlap, and in fact the outcomes are the mechanisms by which we hopefully achieve our overarching goals. Writing clear learning outcomes often start with writing goals, but often when people begin writing learning outcomes, they're somewhat unclear and they replace elements of the curriculum rather than some action by the participants. An example of an element of the curriculum is a statement of a learning goal that we will cover chapters 1 through 5. Students will read X number of books. Here's some examples of two learning outcomes that are difficult to measure. The first is participants will understand the 5 reasons for conducting an environmental assessment. The reason this is difficult to measure is it's difficult to measure what students understand. The second one, students will develop an appreciation of cultural diversity. Again, quite difficult to measure. Let's look at how we might rephrase these two learning outcomes to make them more direct and more easily measurable. The original one, students will understand the 5 reasons for conducting an environmental assessment, but we could refine that to say participants will describe 5 reasons for conducting an environmental assessment. And if they're able to describe 5 reasons, then we can infer that they probably have a reasonable understanding. Participants will develop an appreciation of cultural diversity in the workplace. If we refine that, as participants will summarize in writing their feelings about cultural diversity in the workplace. Again, we can have a window into whether or not they appreciate cultural diversity. Okay, let's do some work. Please turn to the worksheet and activity 2. What I'd like you to do is write several learning outcomes for the course you're currently teaching, or perhaps the course you'll be teaching in the fall. Remember to phrase them, students will be able to. At this point, we will give you some work time, pause the video, and my colleagues in the Philippines will work with you to ensure that there is a discussion and sharing out of these. Welcome back. Let me summarize and give you the take-home lesson for learning outcomes. Remember, learning outcomes are measurable changes in student knowledge, skills, or appreciation, sometimes referred to as KSAs, as a result of a course of study, i.e. learning, as a result of the pedagogy. Remember, they're determined by you, the faculty. We've returned back to our diagram on backwards design. We've talked about the first part of identifying desired results. These are the learning outcomes. Let's move to the second part. How will we know if this desired outcome is achieved? So how will we measure whether students achieve the learning outcomes? Well, what is the characteristics of good evidence? So when we look for evidence of achievement of the learning outcomes, we need to think about what it might look like. the evidence will be course and discipline dependent. For example, if you're going to, in a speech course, the evidence would require speaking. For a microbiology course, it will require something of components of the discipline of microbiology. They need to align with the goal or outcome. In this case, we are focusing on the outcome. So, for an example, students will be able to write. X would require that an activity in which they actually write. Students will be able to list requires an activity where they would list the components of a microbiology exercise. One of the components that is often a learning outcome is that many courses, and perhaps yours, will have that critical thinking as a learning outcome. And so it requires that the activity or the evidence reflects a requirement that students are able to think critically about this. It'll probably require some skills as well, such as being able to write or orally communicate that. Remember that the evidence needs to be meaningful to the student and peers. So what they do needs to connect to the course, but more importantly, it should connect to their lives, and they should see the purpose of it. Now, it should also be embedded in the course activities. Students are busy and do not want and do not like if we add in busy work. So we need to embed this evidence, this assessments within the course activities. Let's talk a little bit about assessment alignment, going back to our 3 circles, those that are worth being familiar with. These might be traditional quizzes and tests. It might be pencil and paper, selective response, or constructed response, short answers on that. And then we could use these types of assessments or evidence to look at the first 2. The enduring understanding one is more complex and more difficult to measure. These often require that students perform tasks or projects or have complex class deliverables. They could also reflect open-ended questions, but they need to be authentic with respect to the nature of the activities and the content that we are covering. Let me give you an example from my own course, Microbes and Society, which is a non-majors course I've taught for many years on microbiology for non-microbiology majors. You'll see on one side the learning outcomes. I'll read a couple of these and I'll let you go through the other ones. So the first learning outcome is students will be able to describe basic principles, concepts, theories, and language that constitutes the discipline of microbiology. Let's look at the third one. Students will be able to critically read biological and microbiology information from books, popular press, journals, and other sources. Let's look at the fourth one. Students will be able to describe how science is part of everyday life. And then the fifth one, students will be able to identify and appreciate the cultural and social dimensions of science. These are my learning outcomes. So how do I align my assessments or my evidence? How would I know they accomplished these? Well, on the other side, you'll see the types of assessments I use in this course. So there are weekly quizzes, and that really looks at learning outcome 1. They have to write 2 short pieces, one including a visit to a local museum in Washington, D.C. Because this is a writing exercise, you notice it covers many different learning outcomes, 1, 2, 4, and 5. Again, they are required to do a group project, and you'll notice that the group project also requires many of the learning outcomes or measures them in a direct fashion, including the fifth one, which is that students will be able to identify and appreciate the cultural and social dimensions of science. And what they do is they do a project and a poster on HIV/AIDS in an East Asian country. And then in my class, I often use in-class activities. And so we see short answer, an essay on my exams, and you'll see that covers learning outcomes 1, 2, and 4, and they read and write about a recent news article, and that covers learning outcome 3. So you'll notice that my learning outcomes are limited. There are 5 to describe, to demonstrate, to critically read, to describe, and to identify and appreciate. These are action verbs out of Bloom's taxonomy describing different levels of learning from shallow to deeper. And you'll notice the assessments, or my evidence, align with these. And they're the normal types of evidence you are probably using in your course. Quizzes, writing, group projects, traditional exams. Let's go to the third part of our backwards design diagram, and that is developing the learning experiences. What are the pedagogies that we will use in teaching our class? Let's look at some of the properties of these learning experiences or pedagogies. They need to align with your course goals. As you'll see from the previous slide in my example, I have pretty good alignment. They need to engage students in active learning. Notice in the example I gave you that students are doing projects, visiting museums, and doing the types of learning activities where they're engaged. Determining understanding requires active and multiple engagements. So ultimately, we can measure understanding, but it's much more difficult and has to be measured from several different lenses. They need to align with the measures and assessments. What you want to do, they answer the question, how does this activity increase the performance of students on the assessment? So if students are taking only multiple choice questions on their exam, then they probably should have multiple choice questions on the quizzes. If the exam includes essays and short answers, then the quizzes should also include those types. So they need to align with the measures and assessment. And they need to be transparent, and this is perhaps the hardest piece. They need to be clear so that students need to know, and students are able to easily see what is expected of them and when are the due dates. So learning experience, align with course goals, engage active learning, align with your measurements and assessments that you're doing in the class, and they're transparent. So students are very clear about what is expected of them and what they need to do. Let's turn to the worksheet activity 3. What I want you to do is think about the learning activity or pedagogy for each of the circles and write it down. Again, we're going to have you work alone a little bit and then share this with the group around you on that. So we are now at work time. I'll have my colleagues pause the video, allow you to work, report out, and we'll come back and finish up this presentation. Here's one of the ways I've divided this up. So, worth being familiar with, I use lectures, readings, and discussions and field trips on that. Important to know and do. Again, lecture works, projects, papers, readings, and a portfolio of work. You'll notice that there's considerable overlap. For my enduring understandings, I predominantly use projects and papers, but you could think about using presentations, hands-on activities, field trips, could be a long written piece, could be a poster, could be an activity within lab. Now, what I want you to do is now connect these learning activities and answer the question, what microbe library resources might you use? What microbe library resources will help you for each of these? And certainly for looking at images, for videos, for graphics, it is a wonderful resource which you now have access to. Let me finish up and summarize. What we talked about was backwards design. It contains 3 components. We determine learning outcomes, what we want our students to be able to know, do, or appreciate. We ask, what would be the evidence that students have accomplished this? And then we use those 2 to think about the pedagogies of the learning activities that will help them achieve the learning outcomes and be successful on the assessments. We try this, we work on it, and then we go back and refine, and that's the reiterative process. The 4th worksheet activity is a take-home exercise. so you don't have to do it here. What I want you to do is think about your greatest teaching challenge, think about a learning outcome, and how you might use backwards design to approach it, and what microbe library resources you might use to address it. If there's time, my colleagues in the Philippines may want to pause the video here and allow you to work on this. This would be a wonderful group discussion, and I wish I was there with you to participate in it. This is the resource on Understanding by Design by Grant and Jay Mateague, and they've worked very much on it. Here's my contact information, and please feel free to email me or contact me. You'll notice up in the side we have the Teaching Resource Guide, which is a book that we publish from the University of Maryland that has lots of teaching tips, and you can go to our website and download the PDF. It is perfectly free. Thank you very much for participating in this. I'm envious. I wish I was there with you in the Philippines. Please have a great day. Enjoy the rest of the conference.